morning, everybody. It's great to see so much interest in this topic, the report, and our speakers. As Sharon mentioned, this report is one of the first collaborations of the Hoover Institute and the Observer Research Foundation. And the report is a result of the joint recognition of the importance of good ideas to sound public policy that is committed to promoting close U.S.-India cooperation to advance common interests, and as the report states, in this urgent moment. So without further ado, let's welcome our speakers. The contributors, Paul Kapoor and Joe Felter. Paul is a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution and professor at the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School. Previously, Paul has also served at the State Department's policy planning staff and worked on issues related to South and Central Asia, Indo-Pacific strategy, and U.S.-India relations. Joe Felter is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution and William J. Perry Fellow at Stanford University. Joe is also the former Deputy Assistant Secretary, or DAS, of Defense for South and Southeast Asia. Representing U.S. government, we have Siddharth Iyer, who is the Director of South Asia Policy at the Office of the Secretary of Defense. I have to say here, although this is an on-the-record event, Siddharth's comments will not be, you can't attribute his comments, and that is just for Siddharth's comments. And of course, we have from ORF America, our director, Dhruva Jaishankar. Paul, I'd like to start with you as one of the editors. This is a comprehensive report covering a range of topics, including governance, trade, security, energy, and tech. How did you, as one of the editors, narrow down this report? And can you elaborate on some of the recommendations?
Sure, thank you. It's great to be here. Great to see everybody. So I think the project came out of the recognition that although the U.S.-India relationship really has kind of now has acquired sort of a natural quality about it, and it's not inevitable. Forward progress isn't inevitable, and we need to carefully manage the relationship to ensure that we continue to move forward. So we tried to think about what the main areas of cooperation would be that would be essential to helping that happen and to ensure that we would have continued progress. And so, these kind of, the authors and the editors together kind of felt that we coalesced around these pillars and felt that these would be the areas that we would really need to ensure cooperation in if the relationship was going to move forward. So it was kind of a collective judgment, really, about what was essential with the editors and then also with the authors as well. And a number of recommendations came out of it, and we bullet them in the introduction to the report, and then go into more detail in the chapters. Some of them would be in the security realm, emphasizing Indian military capacity building, particularly in the maritime domain, also expanding the cooperative space of the Indo-Pacific, at least conceptually, westward into the Indian Ocean. In the governance realm, working together to develop multilateral structures and connect like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific region, and promoting India as a leader in that process. Also rectifying basic disagreements that we have over governance, particularly in the maritime domain, for instance, differing interpretations of UNCLOS. In the energy realm, giving gas a more central and longer-lived role in the energy transformation of both India and the United States than either country currently envisions. In trade, prioritizing bilateral economic engagement, perhaps ultimately reaching a free trade agreement. Dhruva and I were talking about the likelihood as a political matter whether that could really happen, but something that would be a worthy goal for both countries. In the tech realm, putting the major in U.S.-India major defense partnership. I stole that from Joe. That's Joe's line.
Right on.
You may use that again today. Really by sharing with India advanced defense technologies at the level of U.S. treaty allies. So those are some of the main ideas that came out of it. And I think, even though there were sometimes different emphases between the Indian and U.S. sides, I think there was a great deal of agreement on those core issues.
Yeah, and as this report states, it's U.S. and Indian perspectives.
Yep.
So, in your experience, what have been the different touch points of agreement and disagreement in this report?
Well, I think we coalesced around some of those issues that I just mentioned and those main recommendations. Some differences. I mean, I think more a difference on emphasis rather than on real deep substantive differences. So I think that many of the Indian essays focus more on multilateralism and plurilateral structures, where the Americans tended to focus on bilateralism and pushing the relationship forward that way. On tech, in the U.S. essay, really a focus on defense cooperation and co-development of systems and capabilities. The Indian essay focused really more on the threat from tech, actually, emanating to a large extent from China. On trade, I think the U.S. emphasized more the need to sort of drive forward under the rules of free trade, as we would kind of broadly understand them. The Indian essay pointing out that India actually is still a developing country and may not be able to expose itself to free trade in quite that way. So those are some of the differences, but really I think more a matter of emphasis than really substantive disagreement.
I think that's really insightful. Thank you. Joe, you've written a piece with Vikram on defense tech, excuse me, cooperation, and I will get to that. But what I'm interested in is that you've worked in different capacities at the Department of Defense. What first got you interested in this relationship, and what makes the India portfolio different?
Well, thanks, man. Thanks. Well, Drew, first of all, thanks for hosting, and Paul, thanks for putting this together. Thanks to Hoover for getting me here, and ORF for. I hope. I don't know if you work closely with your Delhi-led, but just a big plug for all the great work you're doing here in D.C., Drew. So what was different about India for me? So, or what got me interested?
Yeah.
What got me interested? Well, when I got to the Pentagon as DASI, I had a South Asia, Southeast Asia, Oceania in my portfolio. And I had some experience in the previous life in military special forces work in East Asia, Southeast Asia, but not much in India. And then when Secretary Jim Mattis sat me down for an in-brief, who I'd worked with closely at Stanford and Hoover, he said, of this broad portfolio, your three priority countries. And I'm thinking I had a pretty good swath of countries. Are India, and India. So that was like, if my boss was interested in India, I was fascinated by India at the time. So right off the bat, he made it very clear that India was going to be a priority for our team in my position. So, and what's different about it? Or I forget, is there?
Yeah, I mean, when you worked on the India portfolio, what was different about working with Indians and on India?
Oh yeah. So first of all, and again, I'll put a plug to our Hoover director, Condoleezza Rice, who says the most consequential relationship this century is the U.S.-India relationship. It's really going to define so much about the future for us. So what was different? I think, on that vein, there was a palpable sense of the huge opportunity that in the U.S.-India relationship, if we could get it right, if we could build it, and all the unrealized potential of it. So when I worked with strong allies in the Pentagon, like Australia and Singapore, you invested to kind of maintain a strong relationship. But I think when you're working with India, you felt like you were on this incredible trajectory that you could get on if you could just stay on it, if it was possible. And but it was hard. I mean, I taught international relations theory at West Point and then at Stanford, and states with shared interests cooperate, right? It just kind of happens, right? But the U.S. and India have a lot of shared interests, shared values, shared interests, world's oldest and largest democracies. But cooperation just doesn't just happen. It takes a lot of work. And I remember sitting with then Secretary Mattis and some Indian leaders, it was actually Prime Minister Modi and Minister Doval, and he looked at him stone-faced and said, "You may be not aligned, but we're aligned with you." And I think that says a lot. We are aligned with India, but cooperation isn't just going to happen. It takes a lot of work. It can be frustrating, but the stakes are just too high not to try our best.
Yep, thank you. That's an interesting quote there.
I didn't quote it perfectly. That was my memory. So don't quote if it's on the record. That was my memory of the quote. So.
Ruva, we've had a few American perspectives. So from the Indian perspective, especially after Prime Minister Modi's visit this summer, what do you think India seeks to get out of this relationship?
Thanks, Meda, and I would start off by just complimenting my ORF colleagues and Hoover for producing this report. I would highly recommend you read it. There's a lot of good material there and a lot of good recommendations. I'm going to take a step back. We've talked a little bit about the defense relationship, but I think it's helpful to situate the bilateral security relationship in a larger context, particularly from an Indian perspective. Let me start by saying this is an extraordinarily exciting time in India. That is, if today you have a country of 1.4 billion people, it is, to put in perspective, this is 3 times as many people as the British Empire had at its height. It is growing at conservatively, the latest quarterly IMF estimates of 5.7%. Annually, it could be 7%, and this is considered a suboptimal year given the global economy. Now, it's you have this population growing at this rate. They're just also it's coming at a time of great excitement. You see India's moon mission. You see it's a young population. In 2025 we may have the largest number of people turning 18 of any country at any time in history, and so it's a young population coming of age. Now, in this context, it's also this is also a somewhat fraught and difficult time as well globally. So for India, you have on the one hand you have a neighbor, China, which is much larger, has grown much faster over the past 3 decades, with which India has a major territorial dispute, and which to this day there is still a large major military mobilization on both sides along their disputed border. You have a China that is trying to rewrite global institutions and global norms, in many ways undermining Indian interests and values, and stymieing India at various opportunities. You have other countries that are supporting terrorist infrastructure targeted against India, and I don't just mean Canada, but also Pakistan. You have and you have a multilateral set of multilateral institutions around the world that are, in many cases, weak, in many cases fraying, in many cases ineffective. So again, on the one hand, you have a lot of opportunity, a lot of potential for growth, a lot of excitement. And by the way, that excitement is most palpable, I feel, not in South Delhi or South Bombay. It's in Pune, in Visakhapatnam, in Nashik, in Trivandrum, and places like that, where many Indians don't go. Now, what's striking to me in all of this is, despite all of these opportunities, despite these challenges the level of understanding about India, Indian wants, needs, desires, challenges, is remarkably poor. Just to give one example, there are fewer Americans studying in India than there are in the city of Florence. Okay? There's almost no Indian language study, there are very few Indian language study programs in the United States. So here you have, again, a country, a fast-rising economy, largest population in the world at this point in time, and yet the level of understanding about India is not where it should be. And so it's all the more incumbent, and I think it's great that the Hoover Institution, many other programs in Washington and think tanks at universities are now trying to develop that understanding, that set of skills. So I think if you look at it from India's point of view, in this opportunity, the relationship with the United States is absolutely vital. I think there's some people, we have some retired strategic commentators in India who somehow believe that India can accomplish all it wants to accomplish without fruitful partnerships with other countries, including the world's largest economy. But in my view, they're living in some fantasy land. If India wants to achieve the objectives it wants to achieve in the next few decades, it will require constructive, fruitful partnerships with most other countries with which it shares interests and values, the U.S. being chief amongst them. And where that will what does that mean in practice? It will mean better educational linkages, better energy cooperation, better strategic relations, closer coordination between the governments at every level, better technology relationships, access to that technology, an ability on the Indian side to absorb that technology. So all of that, I think, is in order, and I think this report gets to a lot of that. Even that, I think, is still a more modest agenda. That I think that what will be required, and we saw a hint of this, I think, in the joint statement that was issued this year when Prime Minister Modi came here to Washington for a state visit. But we are going to need a much more comprehensive and forward-leaning agenda for the bilateral relationship if the United States is to meet its global objectives and if India is to meet those objectives as well.
Thank you for those recommendations, Ruva. And speaking of Pakistan, Paul, you've written extensively on the India, excuse me, I'm so sorry, on the, sorry about that. You've written extensively on the India-Pakistan nuclear relationship. And 10 years ago, and I don't know if you agree with me on this, a report like this would have included a lot more on Pakistan and the US-Pakistan and the India-Pakistan relationship. Today, how much does Pakistan play a role in complicating the US-India relationship?
Yeah, I think you're right. 10 years ago, a report like this would have had much more of a Pakistan focus. I think, India obviously still cares a lot about Pakistan. The relationship holds some danger for India, given Pakistan's support for militancy and its nuclear weapons capability. That said, it's just a lot less important now, I think, than it used to be. India's interests have become much broader. The conflicts that it has with Pakistan, the Kashmir issue, and so on, yes, it still matters, but India is doing a lot more now. Its economic rise, its strategic rise in the region, and even as a world player, just give it a much broader aperture than it had before. Also, China poses, frankly, a much greater danger than Pakistan. Pakistan can certainly engage in destructive behavior, but it doesn't have the ability to reshape the region in its own image. And as Dhruva mentioned, right, China is involved in an effort, at least, to remake institutions and to remake the rules of the road in the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere in ways that serve its authoritarian interests. And so that is, I think, the main strategic challenge that India faces, not Pakistan. So China's a much bigger problem. I think Pakistan does complicate the relationship with the U.S. to some degree. Because the U.S. Continues to maintain a relationship with Pakistan that kind of waxes and wanes, but recently it has waxed again with expanded counterterrorism cooperation and upgrading of Pakistani weapon systems, including F-16s. High-level consultations talking about a real convergence between U.S. and Pakistani values and interests. That's not going to derail the U.S.-India relationship by any means, but it does raise perennial Indian concerns about, trust, right? And trust is a very valuable but also scarce thing in the relationship. And so it will raise those concerns. The U.S., because the U.S. is saying, on the one hand to India, we want a close relationship with you, but on the other hand is doing things to support a longtime adversary. So it's a headwind. It's unhelpful. It's not going to derail things. I think that the fundamental strategig relationship and shared interests between the U.S. and India are too strong for that. But at the same time, I think going too far on the cooperation with Pakistan is unhelpful, both from the standpoint of the U.S.-India relationship and also just from the standpoint of the U.S.'s own interests. I think we shouldn't fall prey to the mirage of some sort of genuine convergence on U.S.-Pakistan interests. I think those interests are always going to be quite divergent.
Joe, in the section of the report that I referred to earlier that discusses defense technology cooperation, you recommend, among a couple of other things, adding India to the Arms Control Export Act, foreign military sales credit, and operationalizing the defense enabling agreements. In a sense, this administration has affected some of those recommendations. I don't know if you agree with that. And what do you think a Republican administration might do differently?
I think the short answer is not a lot. Okay, we have shared interests that are there's going to be more continuity than difference across administrations. I think there's a tremendous bipartisan consensus on the importance of the U.S.-India relationship broadly, and certainly that the defense relationship has really been a driver of that relationship. So first of all, thanks for the shout out to those recommendations, and a shout out to Vikram Singh, my co-author. But you're right. I think Sid and his team are full speed ahead on making progress in these areas. So we should all get behind him. But this progress started earlier. It's not a partisan thing. Going back to think about the major defense partnership that Ash Carter pushed under the Obama administration, and I think shout out to the previous administration, all the progress we made there, which I had a ringside seat to see. Redesignated Indo-Pacific Command, for example. I was there with Secretary Mattis out in Hawaii when that occurred, as a real nod to the importance of India and the Indian Ocean region, and as a more of a holistic region. The first 2+2, we saw it was there with Secretary Mattis and Secretary Pompeo. First ever for India and first ever for the U.S. with India. The enabling agreements that we concluded. So a whole lot of progress. And again, I just think we're going to see more and more progress. So I don't want to dodge the question, but here's the point I'll make. And I don't want to, I'm not a partisan person, but I will speak that maybe there is a slight difference between Democratic and Republican administrations. So I think with the U.S. and India relationship, like all relationships that the U.S. has, we sometimes see a tension between pursuing principles and interests from a U.S. perspective. And I would say it has not happened yet, but there's a lot of talk about the progress of the U.S.-India relationship. We could undermine this in a heartbeat. We could have it could be catastrophic if we have a misstep. And we all know the sensitivities that India has. And I would argue that we must be careful. Certainly the U.S. needs to pursue its principles, but not at the expense of our national interests. Yes, we need to care about the quality of democracy and human rights and in the basket of many other things that are very important to the United States and our principles. But we need to be careful how we communicate those concerns in India. We have to be very careful that we don't inadvertently have a huge misstep and undermine our important and vital national interests in the U.S.-India relationship by maybe recklessly promoting our principles, and not to say that they're not important. I think like Vietnam is a great example. We have a lot of shared interests with Vietnam, and this is a communist country that we were at war with, a few decades ago. We were able to set those important differences aside and pursue our mutual vital national interests together, and that's a great example of, I think, how we need to approach our relationship in general. So I guess if I had to show a little partisan bias, which I generally avoid, I think that a Republican administration might be more inclined to pursue policies, like those that we recommend in our report, and that Sid, you're pursuing here on the tip of the spear for us, without tying them to progress or developments in areas that I would characterize as more related to principles than interests. So again, it's not a partisan thing, but let's just be careful. I do think that Republican administration may balance those principles and interests slightly differently, and let's hope our current administration and every administration after this is very cognizant of just how important our national interests are and not to undermine them or sacrifice them in a reckless pursuit of what I might call important policy or important principles.
Thank you for your candor. And it's great to see that it's largely a bipartisan issue. This will be my second to last question, then we'll open it up. A few sections of this report are dedicated to more than defense, and I feel like we've talked about defense a lot today. So if you could give us an overview of the economic and energy partnership, that would be great.
I'll take both, and just getting back to the report itself. On the economic side first, one of the contributions is from Ambassador David Mulford, who is a distinguished fellow at the Hoover Institution. He was ambassador in 2005, 2006, during a particularly pivotal moment for the U.S.-India relationship. And he came from the private sector and has a particular strong interest on boosting U.S.-India economic and trade ties. One of his recommendations, and one you see quite often in the context of U.S.-India relations, is on the objective of a trade agreement, a free trade agreement, more technically probably a preferential trade agreement. This is often held up as a sort of objective on the bilateral agenda. Personally, I think it's a terrible idea. I don't think it's a good idea. And I'll give you a few reasons why. One is the U.S. and India are both net importing economies. We both have large current account deficits. In fact, the first and the third largest current account deficits. The UK is the only one in between. We're both consumption-driven economies. We're both services-driven economies. And so in some ways, while there are complementarities, and there are many complementarities to a developing economy such as India's and a developed economy such as the United States, the ability to actually, there's a certain set of competition for jobs, for particularly manufacturing jobs, which is also politically very sensitive in these two very vibrant democracies. So as a result of that, you see India embarking on the one hand on a series of trade negotiations with Australia. The UK is reasonably advanced. Canada was advanced until recently when it was suspended. The EU has gone back on track. So largely developed economies in the West. The US, on the other hand, and I think there's a bipartisan consensus on this, is much more reluctant about entering into new trade agreements. The last major bilateral one was KORUS with Korea, which served a very particular strategic purpose. There's also been an updated NAFTA USMCA, which has actually in some ways reset the terms in favor of the United States vis-a-vis Canada and Mexico. So my concern is that in this political climate, we will not have, it'll be far too difficult to get congressional approval for that kind of trade agreement with anybody, particularly a large economy such as India, which is actually competing for manufacturing jobs. And so I think this chimera, this sort of, we have this goal could actually distract from some very productive ways of taking forward the U.S.-India trade and economic relationship, which, by the way, the numbers are actually going very well. U.S.-India trade is actually booming in many respects. It's not as diversified as it should be, but it's actually going pretty well. So I think there's a lot more that can be done short of that kind of trade agreement, which in this climate will be politically, I think, very, very difficult on the U.S. side. And for India, I think the only standards that I think would be acceptable in the U.S. would be something akin to the USMCA, which I think at this point of time India will not be willing to meet those objectives. Now, a lot of productive work can be done and is underway, a lot of it through the Department of Commerce here, with its counterpart, the Ministry of Commerce in India, on supply chain security, on improving resilience, on finding complementarities in the manufacturing ecosystem to where both the US and India can benefit. There's mutual investment into each other's countries. We saw a few announcements this year to that effect. So a lot more can be done, including, and the governments can play a facilitating role. I'm not sure a trade agreement is actually that objective, should be the objective because it may distract. And one has to remember that the US does not have an FTA or equivalent with Japan or with the European Union, who are amongst the United States' closest strategic partners. That's on the economic and trade side. On the energy side, very briefly, that is, again, an area of very good news, particularly fossil fuel energy. Prior to the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war, the US was the second largest provider of natural gas to India and the fourth largest provider of oil. And this is a complete transformation from a decade previously when there wasn't that kind of relationship. A lot of this is a product of the shale revolution here. One of the recommendations is to invest much more in the gas relationship, and I think, again, this is an area where there's relative bipartisan convergence in the United States. For some on the left who are interested in climate change objectives, this is a way for India to wean off dirtier coal. For those on the right who are interested in fossil fuel exports, this is obviously a benefit. So I think the gas relationship is one worth exploring, and we'll see some turmoil in the gas markets up ahead as the Russia-Ukraine war continues. So this is, I think, an area worth pursuing. There's a question mark over renewables, where there's been a lot of talk, a lot of discussion. There are ambitious objectives in both countries. The US IRA legislation obviously had a domestic focus, and it's unclear how much India could benefit from it. But I think one of my colleague Shaikh Sengupta argues there are some things that the renewable sector can learn from the fossil fuel sector in terms of creating that balance in the US-India relationship going forward, and we've done a lot of work in this. I recommend that you see some of our reports that are here. So I think a lot going on in the energy relationship, a lot of it positive, but I think particularly on the renewable side, there's a bit of a gap between the ambitious rhetoric and the outcomes that we might be seeing.
Thank you for that quick overview and your thoughts, Hoover. I'd like to close out the moderated questions with if there was one thing you could do to accelerate or magically get done in the next 5 years to further this relationship, what would it be? And I feel like Joe has an answer to this.
You said magically, right?
Yeah.
So magically, a couple things. One is, let's make it easy to get visas to the U.S., okay? That needs to happen. Let's unleash the soft power of both the U.S. and India. Let's create conditions to build those people-to-people ties. This statistic you pointed out, Drew, about more students studying in Florence than in India, that's got to stop. I live off Stanford campus, and Silicon Valley is run by Indian and South Asian engineers, and some of my brightest students at Stanford. And I didn't plan it this way, but all three of my teaching assistants this quarter are Indian descent. Let's make it easier to have those people-to-people ties. I will name that unnamed competitor in the room like about zero soft power, right? Zero power of attraction, zero pretty much people-to-people ties. There's a quote by Woody Allen that, 90% of life is about showing up. Well, let's make it possible to show up. Let's let our business leaders, our government leaders. I remember we had a DIU IDEX memorandum of cooperation back at the 2+2 2018. It kind of got dead in the water because we couldn't, it was too hard to travel and come together. So again, I think two things. Let's fix the visa process, and if it's super magical, let's just make it, let's make like the trip to Delhi to DC only take about a 30-minute Uber ride, okay? Because it's hard. I remember negotiating the Comcasta agreement, and I had to credibly walk away and come back. I had to fly back to DC. Let's reduce the time it takes to travel between our two countries, so magically.
Yeah. Paul?
I guess I'd point to a couple things. One would, one really simple: manage the relationship. I mean, I think that's really important, and it seems obvious. But again, the impetus for this volume was a recognition that although the relationship has this natural feel to it, it's not inevitable. It requires some management. And do make sure you're not missing out on simple but important things. Make sure you have ambassadors in each other's capitals, right? Sounds obvious, but for a couple of years we didn't have that. So that kind of management is important. Other than that, I think defining expectations is very important, and it's something that we haven't really done a good job of. This is a unique relationship, so we're not treaty allies, but we are very close partners, and we cooperate in ways that are treaty ally-like. But we don't really know what that means. So what can we expect from India? What can India expect of us? What constitutes success in the relationship? I think there are some who would set a quite high bar for that, kind of convergence on domestic political issues, on the ability of India to cooperate in very ambitious military projects, far afield from India's home territory and home waters. My view on that is that it should be much more modest. We have a grand strategic objective, which I would say is to, keep the Indo-Pacific free and open, right? And so that means avoiding the domination of the region by an authoritarian hegemon. Well, if India is independent and free and confident, by definition, a big part of the Indo-Pacific is not dominated by an authoritarian hegemon. So the ability of India to defend itself, take care of its own defense, its territory and its home waters, is, I think, crucial and a central issue. And as Joe was saying, other matters, political matters and so on, those will come up. Those will sometimes be irritants, but I think we have to be careful not to let those wag the larger strategic project here and keep our eye on that central shared interest.
Thank you. Sid?
In a similar vein to what Joe said, I think a mobility agreement between the U.S. and India is necessary. And this is a national security issue for the U.S., amongst other things. Essentially, the U.S. immigration system today is broken. It is antiquated. The visas that have been established were for purposes that have outlived their utility. The U.S. is not able to attract the talent it needs to meet some of its own economic and security objectives. And I'll give you one example. There's a report recently that TSMC, which is a Taiwanese semiconductor company, has been trying to set up a plant in Arizona, and those plants have been postponed beyond 2024 because of a lack of human capital. And today, essentially today, the U.S. badly needs basic STEM workers with basic STEM skills, and is not able to produce them in sufficient volume within the United States. It's going to take a decade minimum for even if education reform, which is difficult anyway given the federal structure of the United States, even if the U.S. were to embark on that education reform today, it would take a decade to manifest itself, minimum. The U.S. doesn't have that time. And so the only place they're going to be able to get skilled workers at the scale required, is from India. So for the U.S., it's a national security issue. And I know there are people in the U.S. government today who are at senior levels who are very seized of this issue. But because of a logjam in Congress, nothing is really able to be done about this. And now there's talk, we had one presidential candidate saying he's going to completely scrap the H-1B system, which may be fine, but it's not replacing it with something that would be better and more progressive and more beneficial to the U.S. So that's on the U.S. side. On the Indian side, there's a great demand for educational opportunities, for business opportunities, for tourism. On the US side, and the backlog, as we all know, the backlog for visa applications in India is immense. So some kind of mobility agreement between the US and India would go a long way towards benefiting both countries.
I think we'll take questions from the audience now. We have one right here.
My name is Oleg Shakirov. I'm a student at Johns Hopkins SAIS. I have a question. So recently there were a lot of discussions about the potential expansion of BRICS, and it's unclear currently whether something will come out of it and how this will look like in the end. But currently, what do you think? What's going to be the implications for U.S.-India relations if this process moves forward?
Could you repeat your question?
The question.
BRICS expansion, what does it mean for U.S.-India relations? Not very much. I mean, India is part of member of BRICS. BRICS has expanded, but if you want to see like what have been the deliverables of BRICS, one new development bank. China, it's made so much of a difference that China has created a second bank, AIIB. So that tells you how effective the BRICS development bank is. You have Saudi Arabia and Iran in the group, which means it's going to be very effective. You have Argentina, you have Ethiopia. So, look, I mean, I think Russia and China both wanted expansion, particularly because they don't want to be seen as internationally isolated. They wanted a nice photo op. India, I think, was in danger of being isolated on this issue, where Brazil and South Africa were also open to expansion. And I think saw that this was an opportunity to bring more friends around the table. And so largely, if you see the countries that have joined, they're all countries that have, by and large, friendly relations with India. So I think everyone got what they wanted out of it. Does that mean that BRICS will be a more effective institution? I think I would highly doubt it. So I'm not sure anybody in Washington should be losing any sleep over the matter.
Hi, my name is Ankita. I'm a Johns Hopkins SAIS graduate. All of you mentioned shared interests defining US-India relations. And I was going to quote Dr. Markey, but since he is here, I'm a little wary of misquoting him. So I'll say that there's a school of thought that says that the relationship should be viewed from a lens of shared interests rather than shared values. So do you see, and does the report highlight the emergence of a relationship that is understood by both the sides to be based on shared interests rather than shared values? Because both the countries don't always see eye to eye in certain cases. Thanks.
Yeah, I think a strong, independent India, becoming a major power in the region, a net security provider, it's in India's interests, it's in the U.S.'s interests, it's in the interest of every country that wants to see the region remain free and open, and this rules-based order persists. So I think it's absolutely grounded. I think it's emphasized a lot in the report that Paul pulled together. That yes, shared interests. I mean, it's both. It's not one or the other. But I do think, and I tried to make this point earlier, that let's keep our eye on the prize. Those shared interests really can drive cooperation, and let's keep our But the fact that we do have shared values can only strengthen our ability to pursue those shared interests. But I'm in international relations, or at least scholar. Or at least I started out that way, and interest drives all cooperation. And fortunately, the U.S. and India have incredible shared interests, shared vision for the future. I remember when was working in Sid's part of the Pentagon. In the region, we never asked countries to choose between the U.S. and another country. We asked them to choose their own sovereignty, choose a vision for the future, and to work with like-minded countries that have a shared vision for the future. So I think the U.S. and India have a shared vision for the future of the region and beyond, and those shared interests are going to drive a lot of cooperation.
I think Paul and Hoover have some comments.
Sure, yeah. I think you can't really separate interests and values out completely, but I would say that if you think about the U.S.-India relationship, we've had shared values for a long time. Right? We've both been democracies for decades, right? But the cooperation didn't start until there was a real convergence on strategic interests, right? When the problem of rising Chinese power and the need to offset it and the need to keep the Indo-Pacific region open, right? When that emerged, then you saw the U.S. and India really come together. And when we disagree over values issues, we usually get around those disagreements because the forces pushing from the strategic side are so overriding. So, the shared strategic interests, of course, there are values folded into that. So the idea of a free and open region is fundamentally a liberal vision, and that's something that we share. But at the end of the day, what's really driving this is that shared strategic interest. And so that's, I think, where we need to keep our eye on that ball particularly, and not allow the other things to potentially distract us from that. I think I would just say the biggest blow that we can strike for a liberal outcome in the region is for the two countries to cooperate on their strategic vision, for the U.S. and India to cooperate on that. If we're successful, that is a fundamentally liberal outcome, and that promotes both of our values in the end.
So Ankita was referring to an article by Dan Markey, who's here as well, from the U.S. Institute of Peace in Foreign Affairs, which argued that by and large, the U.S.-India relationship should be driven by realist convergence of interest, not by so much by shared values. And he pointed to a number of historical instances of U.S. and India disagreeing on that. I would disagree a little bit with that, because I think we should understate the role of values in the relationship as a positive driver of the relationship. And I'll give you a few reasons why. People vote with their feet and they vote with their money. And if you look where Indians have gone abroad voluntarily, they go largely to Anglophone, pluralistic, democratic countries, the US, Canada, Australia, UK, and so forth. To some degree Europe, continental Europe as well. If you look where Indian business goes, they go to places where there's transparency, rule of law. Again, all of these places. Look where major Indian acquisitions are. If you look at the comfort of people-to-people engagement, it is between largely democratic societies. Is Indian democracy different? Yes, and I think what that means is we need, in the US, people need to have a better understanding of what Indian democracy is. What is the First Amendment to the Indian Constitution? It's very different from the First Amendment to the US Constitution. What is the context for freedom of speech? What is the context for parliamentary procedure for voting in India? It's different. You have a different relationship between the judiciary and the executive in India as you do here, or the legislative and the executive. So I think that understanding needs to permeate both. By the way, there's two ways. In India, people need to develop a better understanding. I spent a lot of time explaining to people in India that when a member of Congress says something, even if it's from the same party as the president, it doesn't mean that it's at the instigation of the president or the White House, because there is a separation between the legislative and executive in the U.S. Similarly, I think there needs to be a far better understanding of Indian democracy, of what Indian values are. And in many areas, I would still say that on more areas there is convergence on those issues than there is difference, and there are some differences, and that we should talk about those differences frankly. This actually does have an effect for the U.S.-India relationship, and I think we're seeing this. There is broadly a convergence that technology needs to be open, that things cannot be controlled, economies cannot be controlled by a single-party state, particularly in other countries. That even if there may be cases of territorial difference, but they should be resolved diplomatically rather than through a show of force. That international institutions should be accountable. On those kinds of issues, the domestic political character does translate into a convergence of worldviews.
Steve Herman from Voice of America. Following up on that, specific to the Quad, which is officially known as a dialogue, there are those in this town who see it as a fledgling military alliance, and alliance is a word that makes a lot of people uncomfortable in New Delhi. My question is, can India, vis-a-vis China, really continue to position itself as a friend to all and adversary to none, or will it inevitably be compelled to enter into a formal alliance?
I don't want to hog the floor and others, but I'm happy to take that. Look, the Quad has developed over time. It is actually a number of things. It's not one thing. It is a series of working groups working towards very tangible outcomes in a number and growing number of sectors, from infrastructure to energy to technology cooperation, standards, and if you look at each Quad statement, there is much more granular detail and very discrete outcomes. Largely, I would say in the defense adjacent space. So a lot of this is not being led by the defense ministries. Sid and his colleagues are playing a more peripheral role, but all of these, again, whether it's technology, clean energy, health, these are all security adjacent, so they have a strategic importance. Now, separate from that, the 4 countries engage in a number of military activities, including the Malabar exercises, which Australia hosted this year, where they sometimes invite additional partners. So technically, that is not under the Quad umbrella, but the Quad are doing things bilaterally, trilaterally, and quadrilaterally in the defense space, and those defense relationships are getting much closer. I mean, 15 years ago, the India-Japan or the India-Australia defense relationship looked nothing like it does today. Now, let me get to the question of the alliance and the friend. Today, India doesn't have the luxury of being a friend to all. There are 2 countries with which India has major territorial disputes, Pakistan and China. And in China's case, the power disparity has increased in China's favor, and China is playing a very aggressive role. It is still undertaken. There's an ongoing mobilization, a very large mobilization by Chinese forces along the disputed line of actual control. Now, will that translate to India becoming a formal treaty ally of the United States? I don't think so. No, I don't think India seeks that. I don't think the U.S. is offering that to India, because I can't see Josh Hawley or any member of Congress saying, when he voted against NATO expansion, he's definitely not going to say that U.S. troops should be committed automatically into a mutual defense treaty obligation to a country like India, which has a very complicated set of territorial disputes with China and with Pakistan. So, look, an alliance in that sense is off the table. The U.S. has not entered into a major bilateral defense treaty since the 1950s. I mean, if you take out NATO expansion, it really is not something that the U.S. does anymore. And again, the growing public sentiment is against that. So I don't think the alliance is in the offing. But short of an alliance, the U.S. and India can do a lot together. And I think that is what Sid and Joe and many of their colleagues in this administration, in the last 2 particularly, have been trying to see what can the U.S. and India do together. So we're talking about ship repair today, something that would have been off the table 20 years ago. We're talking about logistics cooperation, high technology. I mean, in some cases, India has access to technology from the United States on par, and in some cases more of higher quality than some formal treaty allies. So I think there's a lot that can be done short of a mutual defense treaty, and that is sometimes synonymous, at least in the U.S. in a legal context, with a defense relationship. But India is not interested in seeking that, and nor is the U.S. interested in offering that.
I think we have Asanga and then 3rd row as well.
Thank you. Anga, Senior Fellow at the Millennium Project. My question is actually from Sri Lanka, island state. So yesterday I met the Sri Lankan president. I was kind of appalled by his comments on calling AUKUS a mistake, as well as seeing basically there's no fear of China in Sri Lanka or the immediate sort of waters in Sri Lanka, so with the spy ship arrivals and all that. So there's a kind of a shift in these leaders' policies, I mean, especially quoting the Sri Lankan president. Do you see this in the sort of immediate periphery of India, and how does it sort of affect India's policies? I mean, definitely. So you see, a few weeks ago, I was in Bangladesh and capturing this. So I see a kind of a shift going on in this immediate periphery of India. So this is my question to you. So,
What kind of shift?
Towards China. I mean, obviously these leaders are talking about pro-Chinese sort of, I mean, Vikram Singh was saying in a few weeks' time he will be in Beijing, in the BRI, as well as calling AUKUS a mistake. I think there's a dramatic shift in Vikram Singh's own policies, I mean, Sri Lankan president. So this is my question to you. Thank you.
I would anticipate that those views were being bribed and coerced by China, not embraced by the Sri Lankan president. I mean, I've visited Sri Lanka. I've been to Hambantota Port. I mean, that's the ghost of Christmas future for the region, Hambantota Port, and we don't want it. And I don't think the Sri Lankans want it too. And if Chinese are influencing Sri Lankan leadership, we know where it's coming from, and it's not based on the national interests or the aspirations of the Sri Lankans.
I just say, I think Sri Lanka has to engage in a balancing act, right? I mean, it's sort of woken up from decades of civil war and realized that now it has to look outward and find a strategic locus in a highly contentious region, right? And it's literally in the shadow of India and not too far distant, the shadow of China. So, I think, and China has considerable leverage over Sri Lanka as well. So I think some amount, you're going to see some amount of zigging and zagging as Sri Lanka tries to find its way in this. But I wouldn't assume that those kinds of statements mean that there's a fundamental shift in the direction of China. In fact, I think Chinese behavior to a large extent has convinced even the states that initially thought that a close relationship would be beneficial and worthwhile, has shown them that it's actually quite risky. Right? And there are a lot of downsides to it as well. So I think Sri Lanka is going to be a work in progress in terms of figuring out its own path, and then outside countries like India and the United States figuring out how to bring it into this larger kind of informal balancing coalition that we're trying to construct.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you, to the moderator, to the panelists, and to all of you for joining us. Look, I think we are at the beginning of something special in the relationship. And that's quite clear from what we hear today. And of course, we are also at the beginning of something special because Denise and Paul have decided that we have to work together, ORF and Hoover. And I hope this is just the first of many projects that we do. In fact, we make this an annual affair where we come out with something thought-provoking, take it to the larger publics in both countries, and give it legs and give it and let imaginations work on some of the ideas that we produce. I'm not going to try and capture the very rich conversation we've had, but 3 thoughts for all of us as we close. First, I think Siddharth got it right, and it was echoed in different ways by each one on the stage today, when he mentioned that we'll have to change the way we think about defense IP and technology transfers. I think the larger point is the India-U.S. partnership will require a different aperture, a different framework that does not exist. The U.S. has never been in a close relationship, intimate relationship with any country that is bigger than it in population and is going to rival it in economic size. It has dealt with young cousins. It is now dealing with a full-grown twin or a brother at some point of time. It is a very different relationship. 2 large countries, both of which will eventually see themselves as exceptional actors in the international arena, will have to come to new terms of engagement, and that is already playing out. In fact, I would say that forget this values and interest bogey. This is a bogey for people to reduce the relationship. I think what worked for us is that we have already sorted this out. We have enriched each other's values. We've made you more human to the South, which you weren't. Let's be honest here. You made us more cognizant of civil society and its role, and we are doing that. Your civil society has greater media space. Our civil society changes legislation that have been passed by Parliament and approved by the courts, and we can still do that. We can still take it back. So we are both enriching each other's democratic processes. We are not going to be the same. Let's celebrate the difference, but let's understand the framework of our partnership is different. It doesn't exist. We are writing it as we on the go. And I think institutional partnerships like Hoover, like ORF, and like many others are important. Don't go into the reductionist mindset of describing us through vocabulary used when the Soviet Union and America were sorting out their relationship. I think so. Not only do we need to think new, we also need to, someone mentioned retired ambassadors, or was it you, Dhruva? So that was not fair. But we also need new blood to start thinking about this relationship. I don't think they need to retire. They need to keep reminding us of how far we have traveled. But certainly we need new thinking. That's the first point. That the relationship is different. Don't measure it and don't circumscribe it through frameworks that are irrelevant for this 21st century partnership. This is not a 20th century relationship. That's the first point. The second, I think, extremely important. And I'm going to a different Jaishankar, slightly more eminent Jaishankar. And he mentioned something which is absolutely important. Again, echoed by each one of them in different ways today. that India has to be ready for the world and the world has to be ready for India. And this is absolutely important. In 2009, Pittsburgh, right? We all remember Pittsburgh. We were saving the banks, remember? 2009 Pittsburgh, 14 years ago, China was roughly the same GDP as India today. Same GDP. Thereafter, they've not had any significant years of great growth other than one, I think, when they had a double-digit growth. They've had a few years which are terrible low single digits, 2, 3, 4%. They've had to do not too much to move from $3.5 or $4 trillion to $18 trillion. That is the India story as well. We really have to do simple things right. Food, water, electricity, roads, infrastructure, homes. And we are there at $10,000 per capita income and 1.5 billion people. We are there at $15 trillion. So we are not looking at any great economic and political gymnastics to get to a very large economic size. But the texture of that growth will be very different and will have to be explained to the world. So this is, I think, the second big takeaway. How do we explain this transformational India to the world? Because although you will see it as this $15 trillion economy, it's only a $10,000 per capita income country. So you cannot impose the standards of delivery on $10,000 per capita. People, even though you imagine it in terms of the size of the whole GDP, which is going to be monumental, second or third largest GDP in the coming years. And I think that has to be explained to people. It has to be explained to mid-America. It has to be explained to mid-India. Those relationships have to develop. I think DC and Delhi have done what they could. They have tried to jeopardize the relationship long enough. Now we need to give it to different centers so that they can actually fully exploit it and grow it. So I think we need to really, really explain each other's transitions and transformations more intimately. And the final point, I think Siddharth was, I mean, of course, he has 20 service rules that prevent him from saying what he has to say. But I think there is something significant that we are missing here. It's not about the jet engines or the engine deals or the fighter aircraft that will eventually run on these engines. I think this is, you have to understand, India has signed on to, by signing on to this partnership around that particular equipment, which may not be the best engines you have, let's be honest here. But by signing on to that, India has made a strategic directional commitment that the future of aviation and Air Force and aircrafts that will be important for India's strategic role and defense in the future would have an American tilt. Now, when you buy an equipment as essential as that, you're not only investing into the engine, but you're actually buying a posture, a thinking, arrangement of your armed forces, of your training capabilities, of your supply chains, of your entire literally industry. And in some sense, that is what has happened this summer. And we are not getting it. It is as significant as India investing into the MiG series in the last century. And then for the next 40, 50 years, continuing with aircrafts that continued to, in some sense, flounder as decades went by. Good aircrafts in the beginning, India invested in it, and they decayed, right? So I think this is as important as that. This could be that 21st century moment when we are investing into our defense future in American tech and American partnership. It is as important as that. This is not about an engine deal. This is about a nation deciding, dropping its hesitancy and embracing a future where we will see greater American participation in our critical technologies. I think this is important. So this report is a teaser. Do read it. And we hope we produce much more. So let me thank Denise and Paul and everyone else. Denise is right here, so you should catch her. She's right here, the driving force behind the partnership. So we should convene soon again, and great to have you here. Thanks so much.